California has been growing consistently and rapidly for its entire history, doubling its population nearly every 20 years. California's constant growth affects nearly everything around us, from our schools to our water supply to our roads. California is slated to grow by another 20 million people by 2050. The big question is this: how can California continue to grow while at the same time maintain the quality of life to which we've become accustomed? By far, the hardest decisions we will have to make are in the land use and transportation area. Where will all the people live? How will they get to work? If we must reduce our carbon emissions for the protection of our environment, then how can we continue to have long commutes by car? In the last 2 years, there is a new wrinkle to the conversation because of landmark legislation. Senate Bill 375, sponsored by State Senators Darrell Steinberg and Mark DeSaulnier, defines how California will meet its target for the reduction of greenhouse gases by 25% by 2020.
The New York Times has gone on record saying that SB 375 is probably going to be the most influential legislation nationwide to really halt sprawl. So it's something we have a lot of high expectation for. How we're actually going to implement it and do it remains to be seen.
The Center for Sustainable California at UC Berkeley recently hosted a series of lectures, bringing together experts to discuss the promises and pitfalls of Senate Bill 375.
A very important piece of legislation. It's focused on potentially changing land use patterns throughout California that will reduce people's dependency on the automobile, reduce long-distance commuting patterns, reducing greenhouse gas emissions as a result of that.
California is particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change, as this slide shows: loss of snowpack, sea level rise, more high temperature days, longer, more severe fire seasons, more drought years, severe weather events, etc. And that's why the legislature said we and the rest of the world have to act now to reduce greenhouse gases.
One thing the bill does is require, first of all planners to begin talking about maybe a less suburban land use pattern.
SB 375 synchronizes land use, transportation, and housing strategies at the regional level to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. The bill relies on incentives to strengthen regional transportation planning, while at the same time respecting local land use authority. It requires a commitment to build housing for all future state residents closer to jobs, especially along transit corridors, and it ensures that our land use and transportation decisions create reasonably compact communities so that we can meet our climate objectives. SB 375 requires the state's regions to set targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions through their development patterns, aiming to reduce vehicle miles traveled.
Moral of the story is that carbon stability is built on a three-legged stool. It is about the technology of the vehicle. It is about the technology of the fuel, but it's also about demand. And if we want to get close to achieving the targets that we think we need to achieve, we need to be using all three.
The bill has 3 key elements. Each of the state's regions must create a sustainable community strategy as a land use counterpart to the regional transportation plan. The timeline for creation of the SCS is aligned with the statewide regional housing needs allocation process. And SB 375 streamlines the environmental review process for specific transit-oriented developments. In 2010, a Regional Targets Advisory Committee will recommend greenhouse gas reduction targets to the California Air Resources Board. The various regional planning processes will then merge by 2013.
And the beauty, I think, of this bill is there's a structure in place. You use the regional transportation plans, you use the metropolitan planning organizations who are already prescribed by federal law and state law to do these 20-year plans.
We have to think and act regionally, and it's the regional scale not only is the most significant and the most fruitful scale to address environmental issues, but it's also the scale at which economies operate in the globe today.
We've started to bridge the divide between land use and transportation, I think, at the regional level, but it's still pretty stark at virtually every other level.